Good morning, dear friends and family. Thank you for joining us to the Northern Virginia Baha'i Center Sunday morning program. This is a kind reminder that we will be recording today's talk. So the recording will be shared on our YouTube page, but will be made available in the week for those who wish to share with others or revisit. So we have muted everyone to reduce the feedback. And now we will begin with the program and the devotions, the morning devotions. And right before we start our conversation with Dr. Augusto Lopez, we will have a poem as well.
Los amados del Señor, luchad para que llegues a ser las manifestaciones del amor, 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 del amor, 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 del amor, amor de Dios, del amor, amor de Dios. Oh, vosotros, los amados del Señor, luchad para que llegues a ser las lámparas de la guía, de la guía divina, de la guía divina, brillando entre las gentes de la tierra, la tierra, con la luz del amor y la concordia.
The prayer we just heard, it's, "O ye beloved of the Lord, strive to become the manifestations of the love of God, the lamps of divine guidance, shining amongst the kindreds of the earth with the light of love and concord."
Take the example of Bolivia, for instance, where they adopted the declaration, they made it a national law, they amended their constitution, and then of course an indigenous person won as a president of the country.
There is some positive impact on the ground of the communities. Some of them are through the national laws.
But new law and new policies, they don't change people's conditions. So the next 10 years, the next coming years, I think the declaration has to move in that implementation phase where its provision have to shape right of people to water, right of people to food, right of people to land, and to other basic services.
We wanted to be an early involved in the SDGs, and we want to see the SDGs refer specifically in their context to Indigenous peoples.
But as Indigenous peoples, we are seeing where they can make a difference is if they are implementing all the 17 goals in synergy together.
The SDG brings to surface the issue of people and community left behind. And that is what Indigenous people have been living through for decades.
For the next 10 years, it's going to be the ending of the SDGs. Then it's going to be also the new era for the declaration implementation. So this synergy is needed right now, and hopefully by the 2013, our objective can be reached.
Indigenous Rights Radio, because knowledge is power.
Es muy importante la radio porque es la herramienta número 1 de comunicación de las comunidades y ellos tienen que empoderarse. Sin información no hay poder. La voz indígena es una voz que no se escucha o que ha sido reprimida o que ha sido discriminada o que ha sido devaluada. El hecho de que nosotros a nivel internacional podamos apoyar las luchas indígenas, la cultura indígena, los idiomas indígenas, darles esa voz a las comunidades, pienso que es muy importante.
Casi llevo 4 años de trabajo como productora de radio para Cultural Survival. Al principio nuestro proyecto fue promocionar el derecho al consentimiento libre, previo informado. Esto ante la gran necesidad y falta de información de este derecho a las comunidades, tanto de acá de Guatemala como del mundo entero. Nuestra labor fue explicar qué es el derecho al consentimiento libre, previo informado, cómo lo pueden aplicar, cuál es el proceso que lleva el consentimiento libre, previo informado.
Para mí lo importante es poder contribuir a los pueblos indígenas, no solo maya de Guatemala, sino que a los pueblos indígenas de Centroamérica y de todo el mundo. Y la filosofía indígena, la forma de vida indígena, es una contribución que tenemos a la tierra. Ahorita que estamos con cambios climáticos y con tanta migración forzosa de los pueblos en todo el mundo, la voz indígena es una respuesta, es una alternativa. La radio comunitaria es esa herramienta para poder contribuir a mantener nuestra humanidad.
Thank you for sharing this morning's devotions. Again, welcome all friends near and far to this morning program. As a kind reminder, we will be recording this program. Following the recording will be shared on our YouTube page. In observance of Latinx Heritage Month, we would like to share a video to celebrate our Latinx community members. Please enjoy it.
Que aunque parezca ser el fin del mundo, es el principio de una nueva era. nos esté borrando la esperanza. Cuando el fin del camino nos alcanza, forjarán hilados las espadas. Juntos podremos ver cada mañana. Hoy es amanecer de un nuevo día. Hoy el sol en los prados ilumina como los frutos de un mismo árbol. Los hombres volverán a ser hermanos, tan potente es la luz de la unidad que iluminará la tierra entera. Y aunque parezca ser el fin del mundo, es el principio de una nueva era. Tan potente es la luz de la unidad que iluminará la tierra entera. Y aunque el invierno aún se ha prolongado, por fin llegará la esperada primavera. Tan potente es la luz de la unidad que iluminará la tierra entera. Y aunque parezca ser el fin del mundo, es el principio de una nueva era. Tan potente es la luz de la unidad que iluminará la tierra entera. Y aunque el invierno aún se ha prolongado, por fin llegará la esperada primavera.
Now we would like to invite you to continue participating in today's talk with our community brother, Dr. Augusto Lopez-Claros, discussing part 2 of Humanity and the Path Toward a Just Global Order. During the morning program, you can use the chat box to share your thoughts, ideas, and reflections, and feel free to raise your hand to ask questions. We encourage everyone to participate in today's conversation. If you wish to share questions anonymously, kindly send them in the chat to Alina as the MC, and we will ask them on your behalf. The dialogue today is interactive, so please feel free to share your thoughts, if you desire, of course. Through these conversations, let's continue to learn together and elevate one another's spirits. Thank you so much for being with us today, and let's welcome our dear brother, Dr. Lopez-Claros.
Thank you very much, Alina, for that nice introduction. I enjoyed very much the songs and the devotional program. Are we ready to start?
I can share a poem if that's okay with Dr. Lopez.
Yes. Yeah, we will share a poem before, if you don't mind, if it's okay with you.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez.
Thank you.
I am Brown Girl, daughter of border hoppers. I am Brown Girl, daughter of border hoppers. Mommy cleans houses too fancy for us to live in. Daddy parks cars too nice to ever dream of. I am one of 3 sisters. Men yell welfare at mommy when they see us. I am Latina. I like reading. I like writing. This is funny to other Latinos because time is meant for more important things like cooking or cleaning or helping mommy because she works hard for us. I am Jessica. This name, borrowed, it used to belong to a rich girl my mother once worked for. I am a dreamer, not so good at doing. What I am good at is translating things from my parents, like letters, school notes, landlord phone calls, work instructions, traffic directions, prescriptions. I think in English, but my tongue is dressed in Spanish. I am always missing a word for something in either language. I've been called many things. Wetback, spick, beaner, sometimes even illegal. I became a statistic when I dropped out of high school, but I am still a writer. I learned to do this all on my own. Nose pressed into Sandra Cisneros, Isabel Allende, Julia Alvarez, all brown girls, all born into Spanish and then translated just like me. Daughter of 2 people who knew exactly what they needed and transplanted themselves just to get it. I am still a dreamer and am slowly growing into a doer. And my skin color, well, my skin color only makes it that much more beautiful.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez.
Thank you, Alina. I thought that what I would do today is to begin by discussing some ideas that have been floating around literally for hundreds of years around the subject of global order or the establishment of a just society. This is not something that came all of a sudden into being in the 20th century with the creation of the United Nations. It actually goes back a long time. The question of peace and stability, the need to create a context or a global order that would encourage prosperity and ultimately human happiness. After I have discussed some of these ideas that have been floating around for quite a while and giving you some examples, what I like to do is actually mention some actions that were actually taken to bring these ideas into life, especially during the 20th century, partly as a result of the calamities associated with the 2 world wars. And then finally, to conclude my presentation, I'd like to talk a little bit about where we are now in terms of this debate. And I'd like to do this against the background of a statement that was issued by the Baha'i international community in October of last year, called A Governance Befitting, on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the United Nations Charter. So that's the plan for the next half an hour or so. You know that, as you can imagine, many of the poets and the philosophers and the writers of the last several centuries that were especially sensitive to the struggles that were taking place across the planet, to wars, to battles, to hunger, to pandemics, they would all hanker for a better world. They all thought, or many of them anyway, thought that there also be a better way of running the world and running our affairs. And in fact, the Italian poet Dante, as early as the 14th century, in the year 1311 to be precise, he wrote a book, a small booklet, which in Italian has the title De Monarchia. and which was translated into English in 1949. And the translator chose a very interesting, very provocative title for it. He called it On World Government. And let me just quote a phrase from that small book, where Dante says, "It is evident that mankind is most free and easy to carry on its work when it enjoys the quiet and tranquility of peace. To achieve this state of universal well-being, a single world government is necessary." Now, this is a very interesting notion. Imagine, place yourself historically. This is the year 1311, right? We haven't even discovered America yet. People in Europe don't quite know the breadth and the scope of the human population. And yet here is a poet, Dante, who's already saying that in the pursuit of peace, in the pursuit of tranquility, and creating a context that will encourage the development and the happiness of people, we need to have some kind of system of global governance. Many, many years later, in fact, nearly 400 years later, William Penn wrote an essay called An Essay Towards the Present and Future Peace of Europe, in which he says that the way to guarantee peace and stability in Europe is through the creation of a federal European state. And he actually says that that federal European state should have a supranational parliament. And again, his motivation is to do away with violence and war among states and to bring about an age of peace and prosperity. So the idea of a peaceful global order is around, as far back as the 17th century. Then 20 years later, this French cleric by the name of Charles Castel de Saint-Pierre, very interesting figure in the sort of 17th, early 18th century Parisian salons. He was a sought out speaker, as you might say, using contemporary language. He was very much in demand by aristocrats who were organizing fireside chats in their homes to talk about the problems of Europe. And he wrote an essay, which again has a very provocative title. It was called Plan for the Perpetual Peace in Europe, in which again, he calls for a European confederation. And then when he passed away, there was this French philosopher by the name of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who inherited all his papers, the papers of Saint-Pierre, and he was inspired by them, and he himself wrote about the calamities that Europe had to go through because there was no peace, because there was no order that would better regulate relations among city-states and countries. And he said that we should create a confederative government in which all its members must be placed in such a mutual state of dependence that not one of them alone may be in a position to resist all the others. And many historians and people who have studied the work of these thinkers say that this is perhaps one of the earliest calls for the concept of collective security, where nations work together to establish a context for peace in which the rule of law and clearly established rules of behavior are at the center. Of course, for you Americans, you are, I'm sure, familiar with your own history, and Alexander Hamilton in the 18th century said the following. He said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. But then he goes on to suggest that we're not angels, and that therefore the mild and salutary coercion of the law is necessary if we are to avoid, and I quote, the destructive coercion of the sword. And so this is Hamilton, one of the early founding fathers of the U.S. Federation. Benjamin Franklin, who was the American ambassador in the French court and had already been there for 10 years, and then upon coming back to to America, he writes back to a friend of his in the French court back in Paris, and he tells him with great sense of excitement, you know, here in America, we have established we have signed or adopted a new constitution, and we have established the principle of federalism. We have created a new layer of government called the federal government, which has assumed monopoly power over such things as the use of force, for instance. And you know, he thinks that this is a great development, and then he advises his French counterpart in Paris, why don't you do the same? You in Europe, you know, should adopt a similar document as a way to guarantee peace within the confines of Europe. In fact, many historians have argued, I am myself not a historian, but I believe that this is a very compelling argument, that it was actually the creation of a federal state and the adoption of the US Constitution, which then launched the American Republic into a prolonged period of peace and stability and economic growth and rise in political influence, and ultimately led in the early part of the 20th century for it to be the most powerful, the most dynamic economy, and the most important political power in the world. It was the fact that they set aside war. The states gave up the right to make war on each other. They gave up the right to print their own money. They gave up the right to a range of powers which at that stage resided with the states, and gave those powers to a federal government. And having established this sort of solid legal foundation for peace, then the states and the peoples, you know, could concentrate on expanding, on creating free enterprise, on prospering. And this was a very, very important achievement of the American Republic. In Germany, the French philosopher Kant, Immanuel Kant, said that the problem of international order was the most difficult and the last to be solved by the human race. Kant was already thinking along those terms. You know, how does one create a context for stability on a global scale that then creates the conditions for human development? He said that if we did not think more proactively about the conditions for peace, humanity, and I quote, would face either the peace of the vast graveyard of the human race or peace by reason design. In other words, we will find peace in complete total calamity and death. That is, we will wipe each other out, or we will have peace by reason design, you know, by coming together to some kind of well-structured agreement among nations, you know, that would establish this context. So this is sort of by way of background. The next important initiative, I would say, came in the 20th century after the end of World War I. And this was basically the efforts by President Wilson to create a permanent organization made up of the leading powers of the day, and with the specific aim of preventing war. President Wilson is a very important figure in American history, and it seems to me that his primary claim to fame and what has guaranteed his place in posterity as one of the most influential statesmen of his age is not so much what he did domestically as president of the US during 2 consecutive terms. No, I think it has to do essentially with his effort to establish the League of Nations, which was a kind of a response, you know, to the 18 million fatalities associated with World War I. He said there must be not a balance of power, but a community of power, not organized ribellities, but an organized common peace. And Wilson was a great believer in the concept of you know, collective security. It's really very touching to read many of the speeches that Wilson gave trying to get the population of the United States and its politicians, especially the members of the US Senate, to get excited about this idea. Wilson said that it was a very heavy burden for him, psychologically, spiritually, to have had to send young people to fight in World War I in Europe, knowing fully well that many of them would not come back because of the US decision to participate and to enter the war. In fact, let me quote from a speech that he gave in 1919. He said, "My clients are the children. My clients are the next generation. They do not know what promises and bonds that I undertook when I ordered the armies of the United States to the soil of France. But I know, and I intend to redeem my pledges to the children. They shall not be sent upon a similar errand." In other words, Wilson is very desperately trying to prevent this from ever happening again. He was appalled by the destruction, by the senseless killing of World War I. He suffered greatly because of the responsibility that he felt of having sent many young men, to their certain deaths in Europe. And he was determined that this would not happen again, that successors in the White House after he had left would not find themselves in a similar situation, having to do the same. Unfortunately, the League of Nations did not succeed as was expected. The ratification of the covenant, which created the League of Nations, turned into a kind of a partisan political issue within the United States. Very similar, in fact, to the kind of partisan battles that you see today in the US. And then President Wilson suffered a massive stroke in October of 1919, and this weakened his ability to sort of ensure victory on a Senate floor. The League of Nations Covenant was an international treaty, and in the US Constitution, you need 2/3 approval by the Senate to ratify the covenant. And he fell short of 7 votes when it was finally voted on the 19th of March of 1920, 101 years ago. So this was a great sort of step forward. Let me quote with you what Shoghi Effendi, the head of the Baha'i community between 1921 and 1957, said about President Wilson. Hopefully these words will sort of awaken your interest in President Wilson. He said, "To America's president, the immortal Woodrow Wilson, must be ascribed the unique honor among the statesmen of any nation, whether of the East or of the West, of having voiced sentiments so akin to the principles animating the cause of Baha'u'llah, and of having more than any other world leader contributed to the creation of the League of Nations, achievements which the pen of the center of God's covenant acclaimed as signaling the dawn of the most great peace." That is a reference to Abdul Baha, as you can recognize. Now, at around the time that the League of Nations was being debated and the covenant was being considered, Abdul Baha wrote a letter to an organization of intellectuals and thinkers in The Hague, which is the sort of a formal seat of government in the Netherlands, called the Central Organization for a Durable Peace. And this document, which we have now come to call the Tablet of The Hague, conveys the views of the head of the Baha'i community to this gathering of important civil society leaders. And let me just share with you 2 or 3 ideas that come from this tablet, because first it shows you the extent to which Abdul Baha, as the head of the Baha'i community, was intimately involved and thinking about the problem of global order, which is, as you well know, a very important foundational aspect of Baha'i thought. in the tablet, he says, there is not one soul whose conscience does not testify that in this day there is no more important matter in the world than that of universal peace. In other words, against the background of the death and destruction, the tragedy and the suffering, the calamities of World War I, Abdul Baha is saying everybody in the world desires to bring about universal peace. And then he shares sort of many different ideas, but I just like to highlight 2 or 3 of them because I think that they're very much at the center of his proposals. He says that peace must be seen not just as an issue of limiting armaments or drawing up treaties where countries make empty promises that they don't fulfill, but it must be supplemented by other measures that go beyond the issues of simply conflict and security. He outlines other principles which must underpin the search for peace. For instance, among one of these, he says that religion must be the cause of fellowship and love. If it becomes the cause of estrangement, then it is not needed, for religion is like a remedy. If it aggravates the disease, then it becomes unnecessary. So Abdul Baha is suggesting that underlying or underpinning the causes of warfare, the causes of conflict, in fact, is a weakening of the pillars of religion. It is the absence of moral compass among governments, among heads of state, among people, that gives rise to hatred, that gives rise to nationalism, that gives rise to the kind of animus, the kind of enmity that then subsequently manifests itself in chaos and war and destruction. So Abdul Baha in the Tablet of the Hague sort of goes back in some sense to some very powerful statements that he made at Stanford University 7 years before in 1912, where again he said that if religion was not the cause of unity, if religion did not bring people together in amity and fellowship, it would be better to live under irreligious conditions, he says, because if the remedy does not cure the patient, it is better to throw away the remedy and to try something else. But in his own writings during that period, not just in the Tablet of the Hague, but in other things that he wrote around that time, is very much the notion, right, that peace also has to do, for instance, with alleviation of poverty. He very much suggests that we cannot be ignorant of the kind of economic system of government that we have, which very often coexists with poverty, which he finds demoralizing and a terrible blight on society. So he talks about the importance of education. I'm looking for a quote that I had prepared, but I can't find it in my paper. But no matter, you know very well that education is very much at the center of the Baha'i principles, which he enunciated as he was traveling around in the West. The importance of giving people skills and training that will empower them, to be, as he said, on the frontiers of knowledge, because it is that instrument which subsequently allows people to grow out of poverty and to empower them, to be functioning members of society. He talks about gender, of course. Gender equality, as you know, is a foundational principle of the Baha'i religion, and he also talks about the importance of good governance, integrity, and honesty, and the exercise of one's duties in public office. So Abdul Baha in this tablet, and it's highly significant because, again, this is against the background of World War I. He condemns misguided nationalisms. He says, and I find this such a powerful statement, he says, God has set up no frontier between France and Germany. And he warns, he says, if this concept of patriotism remains, it will be the primary cause of the world's destruction. Abdul Baha was decades and decades ahead, you know very well that when we first saw those images of the planet Earth sent from outer space by US astronauts, we could see the Earth as an organic entity, as one planet for one people. And sure enough, there was no dotted line as we see in maps, separating France from Germany. And Abdul Baha was essentially foretelling to us what we would ourselves see with our own eyes, many decades later, when he said God has set up no frontier between France and Germany. He, in this letter to these distinguished academics and literary figures in The Hague, he says that weapons, after listing some of the most important weapon systems that are then in vogue in Europe and that have been used in World War I, with great efficiency and bringing great suffering to millions and millions of people, he calls them the malignant fruits of material civilization. He says that if these fiery weapons, he says that if religion had played its role and had taught us to be inclined to the spiritual and to the divine, these fiery weapons would never have been invented. And human energy would have been wholly devoted to useful inventions and praiseworthy discoveries. In other words, that those things which his father, Baha'u'llah, said would be conducive to the happiness of mankind. There is one very important proposal that he puts forward in the Tablet of The Hague, and I find it of interesting and historic significance that 100 years later, this is a statement that was issued last year by the Baha'i International Community on the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, that Abdul Baha, in the Tablet of The Hague, had called for the establishment of a supreme tribunal. And he defines this tribunal as being made up of members of the world's parliaments to be at the basis of a new global order based on the rule of law. So this is fascinating, really, and it anticipates, with many, many decades, what eventually happened actually in Europe. The European Union, in fact, has established, they don't call it a supreme tribunal, they call it a European Parliament. But the idea is exactly the same. It started out in the 1970s, exactly as Abdul Baha had advised, by members of the parliaments of the 6 founding countries of the European Union. I'm sorry, that was in 1957, 58. It was in the 1970s that then the members of the European Union moved to direct election of these parliamentarians. And today, we have the European Parliament, which is very much along the lines which Abdul Baha had advised, in his tablet to The Hague of 100 years ago. Let me add a few short comments. As you can imagine, this is a long history. We can review the whole question of global order, for a long time. But obviously, the next step in this long evolution was the creation of the United Nations in 1942. Most people say that the United Nations was created in 1945, but actually, what happened in 1945, and we sort of celebrated the 75th anniversary last year, was the adoption of the United Nations Charter, sort of the founding constitution, if you wish, of the United Nations, which indeed was adopted in 1945 at a San Francisco conference by 51 nations, including the United States, the Soviet Union, and of course, many other of the established democracies at that time. Many countries in Africa, for instance, were not signatories of the UN Charter because at that time they were colonies. They were not sovereign states. They joined later in droves, very rapidly in the 1950s and 60s and so on. But the United Nations itself was actually created in 1942 as a response to the attack by Japan on the United States at Pearl Harbor. Within a couple of weeks of that attack, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, was in Washington at the invitation of Franklin Roosevelt. And on January 1st of 1942, they and the 22 nations that were at that time fighting against Germany and its allies, created this body. And what I find fascinating about that period is that in 1942 and 1943 in particular, there was very intense debate as to what shape this organization would take. And as a Baha'i, I find this debate fascinating because it's, in so many ways, it resembles the kinds of ideas about global order which are embedded in the writings of the Baha'i faith, and in particular in the writings of Shoghi Effendi, who himself developed, some of the core principles enunciated by his grandfather and by the founder of the Baha'i faith, Abdul Baha, in considerable detail. And so those early visions for the UN, were very ambitious. The people who were brought together by Roosevelt, to begin thinking about the concept of this organization, what it would do, what responsibilities would it have, what would be its institutional architecture. They were initially thinking that this would be some kind of global legislature, that in its formation, it would be inspired by the American Republic, by the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which created a federal structural government. So in those early discussions in 1942, early 1943, that is what was being debated among those people who would then create the founding charter of the United Nations. And this is highly significant. Unfortunately, those ambitions subsequently had to adapt to reality. And by that, I mean that at some point, Roosevelt realized that in order to get the support of the US Senate, 2/3 of the US Senate, he would basically have to water down the charter to the point where, senators from Montana, North Dakota, and Kansas, and other Middle America states, would feel comfortable signing on to. He did not wish to see the United Nations go the way of the League of Nations and to become a failure, to be a stillborn institution because of lack of American involvement, which is what happened with the League of Nations. And then, of course, Stalin himself, at a conference in Moscow, said that he would support the creation of a United Nations as long as this body was weak and it didn't tell him what to do, as long as it didn't take away all the prerogatives that he wanted very much to keep, that would allow the Soviet Union to do as it wished, whenever it wished, in whatever way it wished. And so it was this combination of a desire on the part of Roosevelt to gain the support of the US Senate, and a desire on the part of Stalin not to be constrained by an international organization that eventually led, to a watering down of the UN Charter in very important ways, and to the creation of an organization that was, very weak at the outset. All right, let me enough for background. Let me come to the last part of my presentation.
Thank you. Dr. Lopez, if I may, I would like to encourage your friends to turn on their cameras, if they may, please, so that we can see each other and feel part of everyone's in the conversation. Please, thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Lopez.
So, as I was saying, what I'd like to do is basically to come to the last part of my remarks and to just share with you some thoughts on where are we today, against this interesting history, with particular reference to the vision presented by by Abdul Baha in the Tablet of the Hague, and subsequently by Shoghi Effendi in many of his letters and writings. You know, the first perhaps point to make, and this is something that is becoming increasingly obvious to all of us as we begin to confront the dangers and the calamities of climate change, is that the present order that we have, such as it is, you know, is not on a sustainable path. You know, Shoghi Effendi in 1931 wrote something which to me is so perceptive, and you know, as many of the things that he has written remains so fresh, so relevant, you know, so timeless today. He said that the world, to whichever continent we turn our gaze, to however remote a region our survey may extend, is everywhere assailed by forces it can neither explain nor control. So 1931, this is the worst of the Great Depression, right? So exactly 90 years later, we are assailed by forces we cannot explain or control, except that today those forces are climate change, or nuclear proliferation, or inequality, poverty, and all the kinds of social and economic ills which bring so much suffering and pain to large sections of humanity. And then, of course, Shoghi Effendi himself gave his diagnosis. He said, the fundamental cause of this world unrest is our failure to adjust our system of economic and political institutions to the imperative needs of a rapidly evolving age. And then again, you know, this is as current today as it was in 1931 when he wrote it. He was saying then, you know, the world has changed, the world has evolved. Our institutions need to adapt to the needs of a changing world. And that unfortunately has not happened. You know, the United Nations Charter, which was 1945, has remained completely unchanged in its 76-year history. There is no mention in it of climate change. The issue of social and economic development makes a very brief appearance. It is all about peace and security, which is fine. It was a very important issue at that time. But it is clear that it is an organization which needs to be modernized. It needs to be brought into the 21st century, given the resources and the capacity and jurisdiction to deal with the problems that are of great concern to us and that threaten our future if they go unresolved. Now, obviously, I don't want to sound pessimistic. We have seen over the last, to use a time frame, since the UN was created, since 1945, we have seen, you know, great progress in some areas. Great scientific and technological developments, which have eased many of the burdens of disease, poverty. They have empowered people in many ways. That has to be celebrated. We are much more interdependent today than we were in the past. And, you know, it would be wrong to dismiss the depth and the scope of human progress over the past century. We live longer, we live healthier lives, we have less poverty than we did 75 years ago. Infant mortality is way down, and so on. You know, these are statistics you're all familiar with. But, you know, this progress has been very uneven and chaotic. It has left many behind. Its fruits have been unevenly distributed. And in many ways, our global politics and sort of in the essential nature of our global order, we are pretty much where we were in 1945. You know, a system that is based on the sovereignty of 193 UN members, 51 in 1945, 193 today. You know, we see the emergence of authoritarian regimes. We see corrupt autocrats in various corners of the world. We see many people willing to place their bets on ignorant demagogues. We see the inability of financial watchdogs to adequately supervise our very complex global financial system. We see gender disparities. We see 800 million people who are illiterate. We see 800 million people who live on less than $1.90 a day. We see 820 million people who are malnourished amidst the highest levels of global income and productive capacity, you know, in probably the last many thousands of years. And of course, you know, we do have over 9,000 nuclear weapons in the arsenals of 9 nuclear powers. And this is indeed a very malignant sign of civilization, to use the words of Abdul Baha, right? To have weapons of mass destruction that can destroy and obliterate all of the human family many times over is a very sad commentary on our current state. And you know, the irony is that the problem that we face is not lack of creative solutions. You know, we live in an age of knowledge and expertise. You know, we have practical and numerous ways to address the problem of income inequality. The problem is not one where we don't have solutions. We don't have ways to address the problem of income inequality. The solutions are there. They have been for many, many decades. The problem is one of kind of lack of imagination, an undeveloped sense of solidarity, inertia on the part of our politicians, lack of political will, ultimately, not lack of knowledge. You know, in the Baha'i faith, we talk about the notion of sort of a more universal sense of solidarity. The Baha'i faith teaches, the Baha'i writings say, the earth is but one country and mankind is citizens. The founder of the Baha'i faith referred to us as the leaves of one tree, the drops of the same ocean. This idea that as we confront these global problems, we have to act in a way that is aware of this kingship, aware of our common citizenship, to use a term from Abdul Baha. And so this is sort of the background. And it is necessary that we begin to operate in this way because human society increasingly behaves as a single organic entity. So moving forward, it seems to me, and to conclude, you know, we need to operate on two levels. You know, at the personal level, we need to internalize what we have already learned from humans, about the human family. You know, there is only one race. This is the insight that comes from science in the last 20, 30 years. The mapping of the human genome brings forward that idea and gives it scientific underpinning. There is only one race, the human race. Our genetic makeup, whether we're Latinos, Chinese, Indians, from whatever racial background we may come, whatever color of skin we may have, our genetic makeup is 99.99% the same. The differences in the skins of in the colors of our skin and other features on the basis of which we say that we belong to different races only need 1/100 of 1% of our of our genes, right? So this is a human family. The earth is one country and mankind is citizens is not simply a statement of aspiration. It is actually a scientific truth, right? And so that is one element of the solution. You know, we need to internalize, we need to educate our children in these notions of common citizenship and these notions of you know, being members of one human family. And then, of course, the other thing is that we have to follow the good advice of thinkers like Granville Clark, like Albert Einstein, like Bertrand Russell, William Fulbright, Eleanor Roosevelt, and others, who, Woodrow Wilson and so on, you know, who have already mapped out for us, you know, what is necessary in terms of governing, in terms of designing our architecture of global governance. Again, it's not lack of knowledge, it's not lack of options, you know. It is essentially the need, you know, for concerted action. I want to finish with a kind of a positive note, which comes from that wonderful document of last year, A Befitting Governance, Humanity and the Path Towards a Just Global Order, from which I took the liberty of you know, from that subtitle of titling my presentation today. But this document refers to, and I quote, possibilities opening up for marked social change. And this is a very encouraging sign. You know, for the first time, you know, we can see that there is knowledge, there are resources, you know, that could bring stability and enrich the lives of its inhabitants. I find it very significant that the House of Justice, the world governing body of the Baha'i community, which obviously is very much behind these documents, you know, says that the United Nations Charter, this wonderful document adopted in San Francisco, provides a moral framework, and that it has to be applied with increasing fidelity. And what are the elements of this moral framework? Respect for international law, upholding fundamental human rights, adhering to treaties and agreements, and so on. In other words, behaving like global citizens, where we take our responsibilities seriously and we act in a context of cooperation and thinking about the global interest, not the interest of our particular tribe or nation. Towards the end of that document, they quote some words from Baha'u'llah, and I would like to finish my remarks quoting those words back to you. Baha'u'llah said, words must be supported by deeds, for deeds are the true test of words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lopez. This was so very enlightful, and we appreciate so much your service. And as we would like to invite friends to open their cameras, please. And then if they have any question or any comment they would like to share, please, you're welcome to do so. Nikia.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. So I have a question. I love everything that you said about some of the actions that we need to take in order to move into this new phase of governance. You spoke about acting as global citizens and respecting international laws. So how can we intergenerationally come to some sort of, I wouldn't say agreement, but some understanding to move into that direction? Because I feel as though the younger generations, we're ready, sign us up, where do we move forward? And then we have a lot of opposition from other generations above us trying to hinder a new form of government, because it has not served the people. It has not served the marginalized at all. And the sad part is we're paying for these people in power to be in those places. And so it's really disheartening to see that we as the people are supporting these leaders and they are not supporting the people. And so as we move into this economic shift and change because of the pandemic, how can we come to this sort of understanding in what peaceable means? Because it seems a little tense right now. So how can we do that on, I guess, on a spiritual level or emotional level, or just practical micro deeds that we can utilize on our in our daily lives to get to that place?
Thank you, Nikia. It's a very good question, and I very much like the framing of your question. There is no doubt that there is at the moment an intergenerational issue, right? Where my own experience has been that younger people are much more progressive in their views, much more ready, to take the kinds of actions that are necessary to move forward with an agenda that promotes this sense of unity, international cooperation, and so on. Two things that come to mind. First of all the major sort of initiatives of the past century in the area of international cooperation, those times when mankind came together in some fashion, right? Maybe not ultimately, completely successfully, but at least in a way that was radical for the time. And that is, the League of Nations in 1919 and the United Nations in 1945. Those two big jumps, big initiatives, ambitious attempts, to give substance to these ideas and ideals of global order took place against the background of World War I and World War II. 18 million dead in World War I, 60 million dead in World War II, right? So one question, one possibility is to say that we will remain asleep, and our politicians will continue to be characterized by inertia, as long as, you know, we are not shaken up by some kind of, you know, sort of distress, you know, and we're already beginning to see that, right? We see it especially on the climate change side, and the scientists are already warning, right? They're telling us which way we're headed, right? In 2015 in Paris, we agreed that we would bring emissions down, right, year after year. What has happened to emissions since 2015? They have increased by 16%, right? So we're going in exactly the opposite direction, right? So this goal of keeping temperatures below 2 degrees, maybe even better, 1.5 degrees, is getting increasingly out of range, right? And the scientists are warning, and in August, a month ago, you know, the latest report from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you know, make those warnings very explicit. We're running out of time. So in a sense, Nikki, I guess what I can say is that time is on the side of youth. They are the ones who are going to ultimately bear the burden of our inaction today, because the older generation are going to die out, because everybody dies out in the end, right? So the politicians who are in their 60s and 70s running many of the countries of the world, you know, within a generation will be gone. And their legacy to you will be a world on fire, you know, because of climate change. But at the same time, there will be a transfer of power from that generation to your generation. And we already see this in many parts of the world. You know, we see this emergence of young global leaders, you know, people like the Prime Minister of New Zealand, the Prime Ministers of many of the Nordic countries, you know, in many cases, some of them young women, Iceland, until a couple of weeks ago, Norway, Finland, Denmark. These are all headed by women, and young women at that, right? So I think that is what it may take. It may take a generation of younger people who feel in a much stronger way the burdens of the future on their shoulders, because they know that they will have to bear, you know, much of that burden, because the older politicians will be long gone. They will be buried and you know, elsewhere, right? So on the other hand, we know from other statements of the world governing body of the Baha'i community that it is still possible for us to come together. This somewhat pessimistic scenario of us only responding to calamity and chaos is not the only way to go. You know, we could take initiatives, and we have many examples of interesting initiatives that have taken place without necessarily the need, you know, for some prior calamity. And so for me, that is perhaps the biggest question that we face at the moment. Are we going to go the way of pain and human suffering, which then awakens us to the need to do what Shoghi Effendi said in 1931 we should do, which is to amend our institutions to the needs of a rapidly evolving age? Or, you know, are we going to you know, do that simply as a result of human suffering and you know, the stability that comes as a result of our inaction?
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. Payam, Ahavan would like to share something.
Thank you, Dr. Lopez. This is a very fascinating talk. Do you feel that the pandemic has made any changes on the global governance or relations between the countries? For example, you hear, you know, right now, United States is trying to roll out the third vaccine, and many countries have not even had the first or the second. Or has there been any impact over the last year or so that you feel that has really made a difference or change in the relations between the countries? Thank you.
It's an interesting question, Payman. At one level, you know, you mentioned this issue of the sort of inequality that you see in terms of you know, vaccine distribution, right? you know that the wealthy countries, United States, the members of Europe, have nearly 3/4 of their population already vaccinated, and they're on a sort of a rapid path, to achieve those goals which they have set for themselves up. And yet, in sub-Saharan Africa, I think the rate of vaccination is 3%, right? One of the things that this pandemic has shown is the extent to which notions of solidarity are actually good even from a kind of a selfish perspective, right? I mean, the scientists have been saying, unless everybody's vaccinated, right, we are all vulnerable, right? With a virus that knows no boundaries, that has ultimately affected not just the poor and the underprivileged, rich people in wealthy countries. More people have died in the United States than died in World War II, right? The fatalities for the United States in World War II were 500,000. COVID has killed 700,000 people plus, and we are well on our way to, upwards, right? So this has highlighted, the extent to which, we live in an closely integrated society in which the welfare of anyone very much depends on the welfare of everybody else, right? This, in a kind of a grim way, it has highlighted, our interdependence and the fact that we are this integrated human family. And at the same time, it has highlighted as well, our weaknesses. Just think a little bit about, the use that we make of resources and have made of resources during the last many decades, right? Think about the concept of security. When politicians talk about security, what do they talk about? They talk about making sure that we have powerful armies, that we are able to defend our national borders against other nations who may have designs on our resources and so on. Security is very much understood in today's language in terms of empowering our armies and being well prepared, for attacks from other nations. And yet, in the middle of a pandemic, you can have nuclear weapons, you can have very sophisticated aircraft, you can have the ability to destroy your neighbors many times over, and it is totally useless in dealing with a pandemic, right? So maybe we need to rethink about the meaning of human security. Maybe human security has to be rethought in terms of, do we have health systems that are ready to protect everybody? Do we have levels of nutrition in the population that are going to help us eliminate the malnourished? Are we empowering our young to gain the skills and the knowledge that is necessary to operate in an increasingly complex global economy? Rather than, how many more billions of dollars do I need to spend, in order to have ever more powerful weapons, which I remind you, Abdul Baha characterized as the malignant fruits of civilization, right? So yes, my answer to you is, I think this pandemic is leading many people to question our approach, to question the use of resources that we make, and it is leading to rethinking about how we move forward. I know that this is happening in many parts of the world. And so, from that perspective, I think that hopefully we will learn some good lessons from this pandemic. And I will actually touch upon some of these ideas next Sunday in my next and last talk of this month with this group.
Thank you. We have time for 2 more questions. Joanne, if you would like to ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you for including me in this wonderful discussion. I think young people are waking up, and women are waking up to what needs to be done in the world and stepping forth and saying things. But I was wondering that Islam is such a powerful religion next to Christianity. And could the Baha'i community be doing more to educate people as to the true sources of Islam, and how we only here in the West all about the terrorists and the people that are doing bad things in the world. And the Baha'is need to step up and talk about how Islam is a religion of peace and submission to God's will. Can you tell us how we might go in that direction?
Yes, I think that, of course, as you well know, Joanne, the Baha'i faith itself has taught the importance of religion being a source for unity and for cohesion. The Baha'i faith teaches very clearly that what matters in your life is not what you say you believe in or what particular label you give to yourself. What matters is how you live, the extent to which you exemplify in your daily life the principles of your faith. And you know very well, and we Baha'is have been arguing, that the principles underpinning all the major faiths are essentially the same. They are all recognizing our common humanity. They all teach love to our neighbors. They all teach the same virtues, truthfulness, integrity, service to humanity, and so on, right? So I guess one thing that we could do is try to awaken our neighbors, our friends, our relatives, others in our community to this notion, right? That religion properly understood has to be a source of unity and cohesion, not separation. A lot of the things that you see in the world, whether in Islam or Christianity, which give these religions a bad name, whether it's violence or misogynism or intolerance and so on, those are perversions of religion. They are not religion itself. In the same way that the Spanish Inquisition was a perversion of Christianity. And history is full of such examples. So we Baha'is must be careful not to confuse one with the other. That is the reason why we go to the source. That is why we make a very clear distinction in the Baha'i faith between the sayings and the life and the teachings of the founders of these great faiths and what their followers have been teaching or inventing in centuries later, which are, have all the flaws of us humans, right? And have no established connection with the original source of inspiration for these major faiths. Properly understood, there is no fundamental distinction at the spiritual level between Islam, the Baha'i faith, the Christianity, and so on, right? So this is, I think, is an important distinction to make. And also, we need to educate our children in these principles. I always find it very encouraging that in some countries, Canada comes to mind, this notion of sort of common citizenship, this notion that our first loyalty is to the human family, rather than to our narrow identity, whether it's the color of our skin or our country of origin, is gaining ground. More and more countries are basically getting very much aligned with that idea. So I'm encouraged by the kinds of values that I see young people projecting. It's interesting, that you mentioned Islam, especially, I assume you're living in the United States, but I just read this weekend a very interesting article about Islam in the United States, the Muslim community in the United States. It is a very rapidly growing community. There has 3.5 million members now. The level of education of this community is much higher than the average of the rest of the US population. And then when you actually look at the levels of crime within the community, are much lower than sort of the average for the rest of the population. Much more people have died in the United States in the last few years at the hands of white supremacists than at the hands of members of the Muslim faith, right? So very often, we have misperceptions. Very often we fall captive to wrong information. As it turns out, when you actually look at the impact of the Muslim community in the United States, it is very favorable. They are contributing in various ways, to the country's prosperity, and they are, on the whole, responsible citizens, in ways that are above the average for the rest of the U.S. population. But in any case, I digress a little bit. I think I answered your fundamental point. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Nan, if you'd like to share your question, and after on this, we will continue with our closing part of the program. Thank you.
I've been very touched by the questions that have been asked so far, especially Nikia's question. But I want to ask a different one. What signs do you see among the sort of what we might call movers and shakers behind the scenes, the kind of people who supported Wilson in his efforts? What signs do you see among those people, positive signs, of moving in the direction of recognition of the absolute necessity for global, adequate global institutions? And how are they being received?
Thank you, Nan. It's a very interesting question, and I would say that perhaps the part of the world where the political leadership has been more attuned to the kinds of ideas that we have discussed today is the European Union, without any question. It is true that there are within those 27 nations, a couple of isolated pockets of dissent, where especially Hungary and Poland at the moment are going in the opposite direction of rising nationalism and so on. But even there, there is a question as to how sustainable those tendencies are. But on the whole, the European Union has come a long, long way since its birth in 1957 in terms of developing the kinds of institutional infrastructures that explicitly recognize this notion of cooperation, interdependence, and more fundamentally, the need to create supporting institutions that give meaning to those ideals, right? I come from a part of the world where these ideas of cooperation have been around for a long, long time as well. And Latin Americans, we have put forward over the last 30, 40 years, many initiatives, but we haven't had the wisdom or the political will to build institutions that support those ideals and that give meaning to those ideals. Whereas the Europeans have. I mentioned already the presence of the European Parliament, which over the last several decades has acquired more and more powers. More and more legislation within the European Union is done in Brussels. It's not done in the capitals of the countries. In those areas where obviously, like climate, it makes sense to adopt legislation on a Europe-wide basis. You know that there is a currency, the euro, which is already in use in 19 of those member countries, and more countries will adopt it. So there is a European Court of Justice. At the moment, there is this debate between the European Union and Poland as to the primacy of European law, because the members, when they incorporate and they become members of the European Union, they recognize that the ultimate authority on questions of law is the European Court of Justice. But the Polish, because they are headed by a sort of nationalist, sort of right-wing government, they are arguing that no, the Polish constitution, should have the ultimate say, and that debate is ongoing. But I have no doubt that ultimately what the result of that debate will be, and that is that a condition of European membership is to accept the supremacy of European law. So the Europeans are beginning to talk about pulling together their military establishments. Mr. Macron, the president of France, is a great advocate of the need for a sort of a Europe-level peace force, because he argues, I think, very cogently that there is no sense in having 27 different armies who are essentially facing some of the same security challenges as they look at the rest of the world. My hope is that other parts of the world will begin to awaken to those very innovative innovations that the Europeans have been involved already for several decades. And there is evidence of that. You see, heads of state in Africa talking more and more about eliminating barriers to trade, facilitating interaction, facilitating investment, creating an enlarged African space where investors can come in and they don't have to face 40 different types of regulation from 40 different nations, but where they have a kind of a common legal framework. That sort of thinking is gaining ground. Of course, it takes time. It has taken the European Union more than half a century to get to where it is now, right? And they started out already being in 1957, fairly advanced nations with sophisticated civil servants working in government, educated elites and so on. The starting point for many of the nations in Africa is much further behind in terms of opportunities, education, et cetera, but it will happen. So that is encouraging. Europe is leading the way in that way. And I find that very, very encouraging. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you, Dr. Lopez, for being here with us and giving the community wonderful insight from your series. We would like, friends, to invite you next week for our scheduled program on Sunday at 10:30 in the morning. Sorry about that. To discuss the final talk from Dr. Lopez. He will be talking, his conversation will be about economic governance in a post-COVID world. So please feel free to share the recurring Zoom link for the Sunday morning program with everyone, as all are welcome. Also share the flyer invitation on social media with friends and family. Look for us on YouTube to view past and current recordings. And thank you all for attending this beautiful program. And we will conclude with a song. This song, I would like to explain a little bit what it is. It's a Spanish song. And in it, it's about friends, people throughout Latin America. It's a song that people have adopted and in remembrance of those who they cannot find, their family, friends who they have lost loved ones, and they are still in the search of their loved ones. And after that, we will conclude with a prayer for the departed. As we all know, we are all doing this service, and all service is an act of when we are thinking about those of our loved ones who have passed away. It's an act of service, and it's enlightening their path towards God. Thank you so much.
Busco a mi hijo. Estoy buscando desde 1983.
La amo, la recuerdo, a todos los días la espero.
Temos que ter acesa a fé e a esperança de reencontro.
Nuestro corazón del suelo al cielo buscándolos.
Hasta la raíz.
cruzando ríos, andando selvas, amando al sol. Cada día sigo sacando espinas de lo profundo del corazón. En la noche sigo encendiendo sueños para limpiar con el humo sagrado cada recuerdo.
Cuando escribo tu nombre en la arena blanca con fondo azul, cuando miro al cielo en la forma cruel de una nube gris, aparezcas tú. Una tarde subo una alta loma, miro el pasado, sabrás que no te he olvidado. Yo te llevo dentro hasta la raíz, y por más que crezca vas a estar aquí. Aunque yo me oculte tras la montaña y encuentre un campo lleno de caña, no habrá manera, mi rayo de luna, que tú te vayas, que tú te vayas.
Pienso que cada instante sobrevivido al caminar, y cada segundo de incertidumbre, cada momento de no saber,
Son la clave exacta de ese tejido que ando cargando bajo la piel. Así te protejo, aquí sigues dentro.
yo te llevo adentro hasta la raíz, y por más que crezca vas a estar aquí.
Aunque yo me oculte tras la montaña y encuentre un campo lleno de caña, no habrá manera, mi rayo de luna, que tú te vayas.
Que tú te vayas, yo te llevo adentro hasta la raíz, y por más que crezcas vas a estar aquí.
Aunque yo me oculte tras la montaña y encuentre un campo lleno de caña, no habrá manera, mi rayo de luna, que tú te vayas, que tú te vayas. Yo te llevo dentro hasta la raíz.
Y por más que crezcas vas a estar aquí.
Aunque yo me oculte tras la montaña y encuentre un campo lleno de caña,
No habrá manera, mi rayo de luna, que tú te vayas.
que tú te vayas.
Dear friends, if you would like to write down the name of your loved ones, you would like to remember in the prayer for the departed, you are welcome to do so, and to keep everyone in your thoughts as well, from those who have disappeared and friends are in the search of their loved ones. Thank you.
So let
Thank you, friends. This concludes our program for this morning.
Love